this computer. Okay, we're finally using our own Zoom license now. We were sneaking someone else's license, so the settings are slightly different. I'm just hoping they all work. But I've got recording going, so that's great. And the clipboard, my clapboard says Plato's Theaetetus on Knowledge, Autumn 2021, Session 1, Framing the Question, what is knowledge? Now, I think I'll go straight to some slides here, because the first thing I want to do is place this dialogue in Plato's work. So I've got to go and share the screen. If I remember how to do these things, and let me know if it's not showing now. Okay, that's the title page there. And I'm just going to move to the speculated order of publication. Now, you know, some people emphasize this more than others. Here, the relationship of this dialogue with other dialogues is important. And Andrew and I actually think it's particularly important. So I think I've given in other classes this general outline before, where you've got the early dialogues, the Socratic dialogues, which are inconclusive discussions, like Euthyphro, which we did in the second week of the introductory course. Then there's the middle dialogues, which are still Socratic dialogues, but they tend to be more preachy. So think of the Symposium, which some people have done, the Phaedo, which we've all done, and the Republic, much more preachy, but still Socratic. Now, in these later dialogues, they're often not led by Socrates. A lot of people don't know this who have just indulged a little bit in Plato, but they might be the most important, because they might actually give Plato's mature view. And that's certainly my view at this point. So the Parmenides, you might have heard me mention that very difficult dialogue that is profoundly contradictory and skeptical, drawing off the real life Parmenides, and the Sophist, the Timaeus, and Laws is considered one of the last dialogues as well. Now, where does Theaetetus fit in this? It's early in the late period. It kind of fits in there in terms of its referencing and everything. So it's after the Republic, and it's followed narrative-wise by the Sophist, and perhaps was written at the same time as the Parmenides. So Theaetetus to Sophist and Parmenides, I think of as being in a triangle. Okay, so approximately, in terms of narrative at least, we move from the Theaetetus to the Sophist. Now, the Theaetetus is unusual for a late dialogue because it's inconclusive in itself, right? It's also narrated predominantly by Socrates, whereas the Sophist and the Parmenides are not. Okay, so the Theaetetus, undoubtedly, it's very clear. It's a continuation of the narratives. They sort of say, well, let's all meet again tomorrow and continue our discussion, and that's what happens in the Sophist. So it's got narrative continuity with the Sophist, and it's got a continuity in terms of the discussion of, and I'm going to use the word epistemology, theory of knowledge, episteme, you know, the Greek word episteme. So we're going to call it epistemology. So that's the modern term for theory of knowledge. What is knowledge? Okay, so it's got this narrative continuity with this question about epistemology, although people wouldn't say that the Sophist is about epistemology as much as Theaetetus, but I would argue the continuity in the question, and the answer is very strong. So the difference between the Theaetetus and the Sophist is that the Sophist at the end is conclusive and indeed triumphant. We've got the answer, and the answer is an answer to the skepticism in Parmenides. So Theaetetus is inconclusive, and that this inconclusiveness is a sort of inconclusiveness that leads to a skeptical view. Well, you know, like I'm giving away the punchline here to a certain extent, but you know, the questions asked again and again, well, what is knowledge? And different answers come up. And it's a bit like Euthyphro way back in the much earlier dialogue, much earlier feel. In the end, it's sort of like, well, we don't really know what knowledge is. That's at the end of the Theaetetus. So that kind of a descent into skepticism towards Parmenidean skepticism. Okay, so Parmenides, well before Plato, even before Socrates, and he was a renowned skeptic, the founder of Eleatic skepticism. So Parmenides is disarmingly skeptical. The dialogue itself, it's a crazy dialogue to read. Now, the Sophist, in its triumphance, in its triumph, claims that it answers Parmenides. So it's actually the main interlocutor in the dialogue is described as a follower of Parmenides, and he says, I'm going to commit patricide. I'm going to kill my mentor, my father, and that's when the solution is given. So you can see how there's an important way how Parmenides' dialogue is in the background of this continuity between Theaetetus and the Sophists. Now this group, we'll see how we go. I'm leaving it up in the air. We'll see how we go with this dialogue. We may want to continue with the Sophists. I think this group can manage it. Theaetetus is a bit more difficult than some of the previous dialogues we've done. It focuses very much on philosophical questions. There's not a lot of relief with I think it's very engaging, but there's not a lot of relief in asides about myths. In fact, there's not very many asides at all. It stays on the one topic. Okay, but we could move on. We'll see how we go. We could move on to the Sophist and see how it all comes together in the Sophist. All right. Now, so it's Theaetetus is okay. So what I'm going to do now is explain a bit more about what's going on in the Theaetetus in more general terms. So pay attention to this, but don't expect to follow it all the way. And we will come back to it again and again. Okay, so the most obvious way to approach the problem of knowledge, epistemology, knowledge of things, is to take the object of knowledge, an object of experience, my cup, and try to work out how I know it. This approach starts with how we normally think and act in the world. Remember that I started in this way with my cup, and remember how we came to the conundrum. I might just stop the share there. The conundrum was, if everything I know about the cup is in my senses, my sight, my touch, it's all in me. If everything I know about the cup is in my senses, then how do I know the cup itself, even that it exists? There seems to be a contradiction in saying that its existence is entirely internal, though. Internal to my senses, part of me, because objects seem to have some independent external existence. Remember this stuff? My cup, a tree growing deep in the forest, whatever, seems to exist when I'm not looking at it. And also, you seem to know my cup too. You seem to experience my cup. So how can it be just in me? So it can't be just in my senses. It must be external to my knowledge of it, external to my senses, external to my mind. And yet we've just said it's internal. Remember how I said that philosophers often come to this conundrum? Famously, Descartes in his Meditations, which is considered to be a foundational work in modern philosophy. And it's found in foundational work in modern analytical philosophy, early last century, Bertrand Russell's Problems of Philosophy, which I mentioned in our first classes. And generally, it comes up in Enlightenment philosophy. That's the philosophy in the last 300 years or so. So John Locke very early on, Immanuel Kant. The same problem comes up. Now, so this is the approach that's called the analytic approach, the Aristotelian approach. It starts with the independent existence of particular things and then analyzes how exactly do we know them? But this approach doesn't work. One response is that of modern philosophy, to fudge it, to pretend that it works, or to have some kind of workaround. But there's another response. This is that the contradiction of this view of knowledge suggests that there's something else going on at a deeper level, that it suggests a deeper reality. Now, this is the reality explored by Plato and by other mystics, East and West. This reality can be approached by starting not with the known object, but with the knower itself. Not with the known object, but with the knower itself. Now, not looking out for the essence of being, but looking in. If we go back to how the investigation of my cup found the known object in my experience, it's in my experience, it's in me. Consider what is the nature of my knowing, my observing. That's what we pay attention to. If the observed object is reduced to the observing of the observer, then the interest is in the nature of observation. The nature of observation of my experienced objects, the nature of my knowing. This is where Plato gets back to the mind's eye, to its immediate knowledge of forms, its immediate knowledge of insensible forms. These are the forms of all observation. All observation takes this form. And so to his so-called theory of forms. So, hopefully you followed me some way there. Now, what's going on in Theaetetus? There's a twist here, and it's important. In Theaetetus, Plato takes the analytic approach. Yes, Plato takes the analytic approach, the looking down, not looking up, the Aristotelian looking down. Socrates and Theaetetus start with the ordinary understanding of sensible objects. They're out there, and find no way out. The dialogue is inconclusive. The dialogue leads to skepticism. You are left wondering how we can know the external world at all. Descent into skepticism in this way was repeated again and again through the history of philosophy. We can see this happening in the Hellenistic period after Epicureanism emerged. We can see this happening in the 16th century, just before Descartes. So it emerges again and again. And remember, as I've said, that Plato's philosophy is founded on a deep skepticism. It's this skepticism that it's founded on. This dialogue delves into the depths of that skepticism. But here in the depths of Plato or Socratic skepticism is found a gateway to a new reality. This is found through considering forms that we have been discussing from day one. So you folks are an advantage here, and it's all perhaps in some ways been worth it, struggling with those opposite forms, because this is where you will now see how important they are. The most elementary forms are the most abstract, if you like. One and not one, being not being, same other, greater, smaller, static, dynamic. And there's some others. These most elementary forms are explored in Parmenides and the Sophist, but not in Theaetetus. Theaetetus is just the first stage, the descent into skepticism. Okay, so let me finish by putting this in another way. Remember Aristotle pointing down, right, in the painting from the Vatican, from the Renaissance, and Plato's pointing up. And we sort of say pointing in, if you like, pointing into the knower, into the forms. Aristotle down to the being of particular material things, Plato up to the essential being of the forms. Well, here in Theaetetus, Plato is pointing down and showing that ultimately that path is barren. It leads to a desert, or it doesn't work. And this is why, on its own, even if you don't engage with the advanced theory of forms that we find in the other 2 points of that triangle I had on the screen, this is why it can be nice. This can be, the Theaetetus can be a nice, if skeptical, introduction to the modern debate over epistemology. The debate over epistemology that we find throughout modern analytic, enlightenment, whatever word you want to use, philosophy. So we have today, we in this course, it's quite deep in terms of the philosophy, deeper than we've gone before. But I think you guys are up to it, and you know, I really look forward to going through this with you. So before we move into today's actual reading, are there any questions, comments, or reflections on that little summary, or anything else?
I might just say one thing.
Yeah, please.
I think that often perception talked of as 2 schools of thought. There's the idea, as Bernie was saying, you know, an object is separate from you. You discover it, you uncover it, you encounter it, it's there. That's, you could call that representational perception. Then there's an idea that as we encounter the world, you have objects in the world, and you have us as perceiving subjects, and there's an interaction between them, and the world arises from that interaction. So we are the co-authors of the world. The world as we experience it is a joint product of us and the world meeting each other. And that, we could call that a causal theory of perception. And that is the perception that Plato is exploring here in the Theaetetus. He, as Bernie was saying, he he kind of dismisses a representational thing. He's not interested in it. Then he goes into the causal theory, in which the world as we experience it is co-authored by us as the kind of beings we are. We make our senses construct. He's not saying the world is a dream and it's all in our minds, but our senses construct it in the way we experience it. So.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah. Anyone else? Did that make sense at all in terms of what I'm trying to say that Plato's trying to do with this dialogue? Exploring this approach to what is knowledge. It's kind of like a naive approach.
What Andrew brought up, as I understood it also, is that is the point that everything's connected, interrelated, that we're not we can't be isolated or separated, where everything, all creation and us are connected, interrelated.
Right, and I'll say to that the criticism from representationalism or the correspondence theory of truth. This is where you sort of say, well, there's appearance and then there's reality. There's my perception of the cup, and then behind that there's a cup itself that's giving me my perception in a fundamental sort of way. From that point of view, if you think in that way, if you think as an Enlightenment philosopher, the only way you can see the Platonic point of view is as a solipsism, as a retreat into the self, and that the world outside doesn't exist at all. So you're just relating that to the interconnectedness stuff, Alexandria. Yeah. So it sees that, well, look, what you're saying, what Plato's saying, or this view saying, you're saying that nothing exists just because you're saying that it's not founded in this material reality beyond your experience.
Bernie, did I understand it correctly where you've said the Theaetetus is the descent into skepticism, and you've got here Plato is pointing down as opposed to up and showing it leads nowhere, that it's barren. So I kind of like that, because I go, well, he hasn't just entirely dismissed anything. He's really exploring every avenue, even the ones that he's not so sure of, or the ones that I don't know where I'm going with this, but I think I like the fact that he's exploring and helping us to explore even the places where he thinks there may even be a dead end. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, and this is the thing that I often reiterate, that Platonism is founded in skepticism. You need to realize that this approach doesn't work. You need to recognize that it doesn't work and abandon it. But to do that, you have to do an exploration like we're going to do in this class. So it's just to pick up from Andrew. So it starts off with this appearance and reality thing, and then it goes to, we'll get to it soon, Protagoras, where he kind of sees Protagoras, a sophist, saying, well, there is only appearance. Instead of having the correspondence between the material and reality, which we don't, and the appearance, it's like, forget that, there's only appearance. And there's a modern version of that, especially in the way it's presented here, which people might have heard of, which was a rejection of Kantian, this correspondence, which was called phenomenology. And phenomenology is a rejection of the thing in itself and saying that there's only the appearance. And so, according to Plato, Protagoras deals with this in a particular way, but he's probably, well, he suggests that he's kind of expanding on it. He gives these big hints that he's expanding. That implies this and this implies that. So, and we can see the tension between these two different points of view, then what's more important, the subjectiveness or the objectiveness? And you'll see through all this philosophy where you've got this push towards subjectiveness, phenomenology, the phenomena, not the noumena, the phenomena, not the thing in itself. And then you've got other people who are called positivists or something like that, maybe in a derogatory way, who put more of the focus on the object. And it's this subject-object thing, this appearance and reality sort of thing, this correspondence, the material reality and the appearance in your senses, that Plato completely rejects. And a lot of modern philosophers don't realize that or can't come to it because they can't see how he possibly could. Okay, so we'll get into the mess of all this tensions in all this in the next 6 weeks. Okay, anyone else? All right, well, look, if you've got some more questions, I can have more of a discussion at the end. What I might do now is just get straight into the dialogue itself, if people are happy with that. So, okay, so it's an unusual dialogue, as I said, because it's inconclusive. It's also unusual dialogue because it's the only one that is described as being written down and then read out. It's unusual because it's a late dialogue where Socrates is dominating. So it's interesting and unusual in many ways. So it opens with Euclides relating a dialogue between Theodorus, Theaetetus, and Socrates. So the scene of this framing narrative, right? Remember we talk about there's these framing narratives. The scene of the framing narrative, what we open up with, is in the city of Megara, which is near Athens. And its fame philosophically is for the Megarian skeptics. Now, the Megarian skeptics continued on from the Eleatic skeptics, Parmenides and Zeno, as in Zeno's paradox, Parmenides that we've been mentioning, and as is represented in the dialogue, the Parmenides. Now, Parmenides and Zeno were long dead in Plato's time, but then Megarian skepticism was the prevailing skepticism. Now, Euclides, or Euclid, was, this Euclid anyway, was the famous founder of this school. So we've got the founder of this school really interested in this discussion that happened previously between Theodorus, Theaetetus, and Socrates. And he went to Socrates and he got an account of it, and then he wrote it down, and then he went back to Socrates and sort of, fixed it up until he finally got, a finished, supposedly, with fidelity to the original dialogue. Okay, so we're in Megara, we're the founder of Megarian skepticism, and we've got him interested in this dialogue. So that's suggesting some stuff already, isn't it? Euclides gets the slave to read it. And so we enter the world of the dialogue, where we've got Theodorus and Socrates. They're at an outdoor gymnasium, enjoying the view, and they're chatting now, and they're chatting away. And Theodorus is a visitor from Cyrene, which is on the African coast, so on the other side of the Mediterranean Adriatic. And he's a famous geometer who's in Athens teaching mathematics. Now, the younger Theaetetus, much younger than Theodorus, is also speculated to be a great mathematician working in around Plato's academy. And there is, if you read the history of Greek mathematics, you will see speculation about what Theodorus invented or discovered or whatever, and discoveries attributed to Theaetetus. However, of both these mathematicians, the historical persons, not the fictional ones we're reading here, we mostly know them through these fictional accounts. But they were real people, and they seem to be people of some renown. Okay, so Plato asked Theodorus, since he's been teaching in Athens, you know, have you come across any good students? And Theodorus gets really excited and says, well, actually, you might think I'm in love with him, but I'm not. I have this amazing student, this young Athenian who's just amazing. And he goes on, attributing to him all the right qualities of a philosopher. Now, those people have done the Republic. Remember, there's this account of what is the philosopher nature. There is some correspondence here between all these characteristics attributed to Theaetetus and the philosopher nature that one would look for in the potential guardian that would be trained up and be the ruler of Plato's Republic. So Theodorus gets Socrates excited and says, well, you know, like, he's very keen to meet this guy. Theodorus says, well, here he is coming right now. When Theaetetus arrives, it's quite funny, really. It's quite abrupt. Socrates immediately jumps in and brings up the topic quite quickly of epistemology. And the dialogue pretty much sticks to that theme all the way. There aren't very many asides, unlike a lot of other dialogues, and there's no colour with myths at all. So, but it's still fun. It's still fun. Now, the discussion circles around it. We're just beyond the reading today. Circles around the philosophy of Protagoras, as I've already mentioned. I might just say a little bit about that. The philosophy of Protagoras is explicitly discussed, paraphrased, interpreted, and extended by implication for much of the dialogue. And it's related to the philosophy of Parmenides and the philosophy of another very interesting pre-Socratic, as it said, philosopher, Heraclitus. Okay, so we've got Protagoras, Heraclitus, and Parmenides, and the discussion sort of revolves around their views on philosophy in general, but theory of knowledge in particular. Now, Protagoras, who was he? He was a famous sophist, a teacher of rhetoric, dead by the dramatic time of the dialogue. He wasn't just a teacher of rhetoric, he had a philosophical view. Unfortunately, we have only fragmented accounts of his teachings, so we don't have any original text by him. The famous slogan of Protagoras is, "Man is the measure of all things." Now, that could mean many things. It's given a particular interpretation in Plato, and we explore what Plato considers this to mean as we go along. In general terms, we can say that it seems to be an extreme subjectivism. So remember, I was talking about appearance and reality. Positivists are very interested in give more emphasis to the object, and subjectivists give more emphasis to the appearance and the observation of the observer. So in general, we can say that that this view, man is the measure of all things, is an extreme subjectivism. And it's saying that what appears to any individual is what is true to that individual, and you really can't say any more than that. If we say there is appearance, how things appear in our senses, and reality, how they appear how they really are in themselves, how they really are in themselves. Then Protagoras is saying, well, forget about how things really are in themselves. The interest is, all we know is their appearance. Plato has it that man is the measure, is saying that knowledge is perception. And we'll get straight into that with the reading next week. The hypothesis that knowledge is perception as an interpretation of there is only appearance, as an interpretation of the slogan, man is the measure of all things. So back to the dialogue. Socrates starts right out, no small talk, and says, well, Theaetetus, Theodorus says that you look like me, but should we trust him? Does he have the authority on this matter? And he says, well, you know, like with tuning lyres, making them in harmony, getting the tuning right, the expert is the musician. With the likeness of people's faces, the expert is the painter. But Theodorus is not a painter. But Theodorus praised your virtue and wisdom, the virtue and wisdom of your soul. Is he an expert in this? Well, yes. Astronomers and mathematicians are experts in wisdom, and Theodorus is one of those, famously. And so, in that way, we should trust him. Which, of course, is interesting here, isn't it? Because, you know, it just gives the emphasis on the mathematical sciences that Plato has, that they are important. And so if we're talking about wisdom and the virtue of the soul, then if you're an expert in mathematics, then you must be an expert in that. And so this is how we now segue into the discussion. So Socrates says, well, therefore, if we can trust him, isn't it worthwhile, my dear Theaetetus, to examine the one who is praised in this way by Theodorus? And so Socrates starts his examination of Theaetetus with a problem, the problem of knowledge. What is knowledge? Socrates says, learning is growing wiser. Knowledge and wisdom are of the same type. Now, this is in page 145e. So he's bringing knowledge and wisdom together. Now, just to comment on that, we know that wisdom is treated as something higher than knowledge, but what I think what he's really saying here, and it could be interpreted in different ways, is that wisdom is the higher knowledge, but they're kind of the same sort of thing. Okay, but what is this type called knowledge, which includes wisdom? So Theaetetus starts out and says, well, knowledge is, you know, like geometry and science. Well, what I've been doing with Theodorus, that's why I go to his classes, you know. And it's also like, you know, the crafts, like a carpenter, you know, that's knowledge. Theodorus is set here to say, well, knowledge is knowledge of geometry or knowledge of carpentry. So he's using, if you like, the word to be defined in the definition. Socrates says, well, look, I wasn't asking for different types of knowledge. I was asking for knowledge in itself. What is knowledge in itself? And here there's a comparison with many other places where the dialogue starts with the search for a definition, where the initial definition is given up, giving the different types. And some of you might remember, although it was a long time ago, in Euthyphro with piety, that's how the discussion initially starts. And this is moving towards attention to the forms, to these kind of abstract ideas of what is piety, what is justice as it moves in Euthyphro. And here it is, well, what is knowledge? What is knowledge in itself? What is it to say that I know a particular thing or a particular object. Okay, so so now there's this kind of like, it does feel like an insert. Okay, this is where Theaetetus says, well, maybe it's a bit like what Theodorus got us to do. And here there's this cryptic description of a mathematical diagram, quite a complicated diagram it seems, and reference to the proof of the irrationality of square roots. So this was a big problem at the time. I might have mentioned it before. When you get to measure, and people who have done geometry, the geometry class will be a bit more aware of this than others, but I'll just briefly go through it. In fact, in the geometry class, we look at the speculated diagram that's described here. But basically, the problem was when you get to measure in plane geometry, like you draw a square and then you draw the diagonal of the square, which by Pythagoras' theorem is the square root of 2. You can't express the square root of 2, or most irrationals, most of these diagonals, if it's a 1 by 1 square, or if it's a 2 by 1 square, it's a square root of 5, and so on. There's all these different ones that you can work out by Pythagoras' theorem. Most of them you can't express as rational fractions. So we know this when we think of pi or something. We know it's 3.14 or whatever. Square root of 2 is 1.42, I think, and so on and so on. It can't actually be expressed as a number. So this was a problem in trying to work out what's going on in measurement and how to relate measurements of different types, different diagonals to each other, and also how to relate them to number. So there's measurement and there's number and how to relate them all. And so this is clearly what's going on here. Now, there's a speculation that this diagram is a particular diagram that is now called the spiral of Theodorus. So I'm just going to share the screen and show you this because it's quite interesting. This is an aside in a way. It's a very small aside, but it's an interesting aside for us. So there's my triangle there. So this is speculated, the diagram that is described as being drawn. So what happens here is that you've drawn a square or a triangle, let's say a triangle, but you can imagine a square there that is 1 by 1, right? And its diagonal, or the hypotenuse of the right angle triangle by Pythagoras' theorem, is root 2. And then you make another square, we can't see it there, or you make another right angle triangle, which has a side of root 2 and another side of 1, and its hypotenuse or diagonal is root 3. And as you keep going around here, making this side of 1 each time at right angles, what you find using Pythagoras' theorem, we don't need to worry about how this happens now, you can probably do the calculation later if you're interested, is you get this progression of the square roots of the counting numbers. And one of the hints that this is what was being described is that it says, oh, Theodorus went up to root 17, but had to stop there because it got entangled. And we can see that we've gone around one circumference. And if we go to root 18, it will get entangled here. But you can, in fact, and people do make this, and there's lovely, if you go on the internet, you can see the spiral going on forever, sometimes in a dynamic sort of way. So basically you can relate all the square roots of the natural number series. So we can see here that all these terms, all these square roots, all these irrationals, like the square root of 4 here is not irrational, that's 2, but most of the others are irrational. They can all be related to each other. So they can't be related to the numbers, but all these measurements can be related to each other. They're kind of in a ratio to each other. And so perhaps this is what was important. And so a bit later, Socrates says to Theaetetus, just as you embraced all the square roots in one form, and he uses the word for form that's used elsewhere for, as in the theory of forms, try to designate the many forms of knowledge by one definition, the word logos. Now we'll remember that logos also means ratio, it means definition or account or whatever, but it also means ratio. So it seems like what's going on here is Plato is saying, well, look, in this mathematics, we've managed to relate all these seemingly unrelated irrational numbers. And so this is what we want to do with knowledge. We think of all these knowledges as different, but we want to find how they are the same. So that's one way of interpreting it. And just on the other side, I did a blog on this, and I've actually written a paper a couple of years ago about this using a different notational system. But on the right, it's basically showing how you start with the root 2 there, you go to root 3, root 4, root 5, and you can actually express them all in terms of root 2. Showing how they're all related. And this was important for the mathematics to see how the mathematics is all related to itself and it's not disjoined. It was important for their philosophy. Okay, so I hope that's kind of helpful. But anyway, it's thrown in there and it kind of, well, what exactly was that all about? As you know, most of these, oh yeah, so, okay, we've done all that, yeah. All right, so, okay, so what have we done here? We've basically introduced the topic of what is knowledge. Gone through knowledge is different, there are all these different types of knowledge. There's knowledge of, how to make a wheel, how to be a carpenter, how to make a saddle, how to do geometry. And Theaetetus says, well, okay, what you're asking me to do to find a general logos, right, of knowledge is a bit like this diagram where I've done a general logos of all what we call the surds or the square roots or the diagonals. I've done this logos that relates them all. Now that's what we need to do with knowledge. So this is opening up the question. And then we will soon proceed on with this question with various hypotheses for what it is. But what happens now is the main aside in this dialogue, which is the aside about Socrates being a midwife. Yeah. So before we get into that, are there any comments or reflections?
Yeah, I'll just say that mathematics for the ancient Greeks was the most exact form of knowledge. It was like the highest form of knowledge. So it's probably not a coincidence that Theaetetus is bringing in square roots and his method of solving them as a kind of, he's saying this is the highest kind of knowledge implicitly. He's not saying that in so many words, but yeah.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Yeah. Anyone else about that? It's pretty straightforward there, isn't it? Except for the mathematics, but introducing the topic. Now we know what we're going for. So the task is to find the form of knowledge and express it as one logos, one account, but it's related to things being in relation or in ratio to each other, in relation to each other, finding their relationship on the analogy of the relationship of ratios. So this is where Theaetetus comes out and complains. He says, well, look, actually, I know what you're getting at here. And I've tried to work this out. And I've found no answer. And when other people offer answers, it's not satisfying at all. And yet, I can't get rid of the feeling of concern about this matter. So Theaetetus is saying that it's tormenting him. And Socrates comes in and says, well, Theaetetus, that's because you're experiencing labor pains. You're pregnant, but I am a midwife, just as my mother was a midwife, only I administer to young men and not young women. So did any people get up to this section of the dialogue? Can I see some nodding heads? Yeah. So do folks want to sort of give me a bit of an idea of how Socrates uses this analogy of the midwife and extends the analogy? Because I think it's quite interesting. And actually, this analogy is often used in later, referred back to in, it became quite famous and was referred back to amongst later Platonists. So how did he use this analogy? Anyone want to start?
Can I just say the one thing that I remember from that? I was surprised by the analogy, but he talked about how he leads the person to deliver the offspring. So he plays that facilitating sort of role as a midwife, which is like a true teacher, because he's not telling you something in your rote learning, you're actually discovering it and learning it for yourself through that process. So I think do you know what I mean?
Yes. And why does he claim he's not telling it? I mean, there's two reasons, but there's one important reason: because he's barren.
Oh yeah, I remember that too. Yes.
He's barren.
And it was interesting. Did he say that you don't have midwives who are of bearing ability or something like that? Yeah, I've listened to other stuff in midwives recently, and I thought it might have been elsewhere. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Anyone else about that midwife and being barren and the goddess of midwives and so on? Anyone want to explore that a bit?
Artemis, who was the goddess of childbirth, yet she herself never had any children. So that's interesting. And another interesting point is when he extolled the midwives, and yes, they can help you through childbirth, but also if they can give you medication to abort. So he, being a midwife, can also administer that if your premises or your ideas are not leading you where they should be leading you. I found that interesting as well.
Yes, that's right. Socrates delivers foolish notions so that they can be thrown away. And, I wonder if this relates to sort of exposing the practice of exposing the child, if it's decided they don't want to bring up the child, which was a practice. He does not allow pretense to knowledge. Not everyone likes to be unburdened of their foolish notions in this way, and not surprisingly, they get angry. And I think this is where he says, midwives are also matchmakers, and I think he pushes the ones that, aren't very talented over to the sophists, or the ones that keep bearing foolish notions. So. and he talks about, I remember he talks about a wind egg, you know, is it a real child or is it just an image? So, you know, relates to the Republic, you know, is it real or is it a mere shadow? Is it a wind egg or is it a real baby? Yeah, anyone else with reflections on this analogy?
So it wasn't clear to me when I read that, is he saying he's saying he's barren when it comes to knowledge as a way of adopting a method to help other people? Or is he actually saying he thinks he's barren in terms of attaining knowledge?
Well, Paul, I think it relates to the Apology. Do you remember the Apology, where Socrates says, what I discovered, remember the prophecy of Delphi?
Yes.
Where his mate went to Delphi and said, there's none wiser in Athens than Socrates. And Socrates sees this as an enigma, as a riddle. And so he goes around and asks all the people, and then he realizes that he's wise. He knows nothing. He knows nothing. He has no wisdom, but he realizes that the wisdom he has is that he knows that.
Yeah. So I recall that, but then, I mean, that observation itself is an indication of wisdom, I guess.
Well, wisdom is ignorance. Yeah.
Or is it, I guess what I'm saying is Socrates is wise enough to know that he knows nothing, which itself is an indication of wisdom, I guess.
How do other people find that?
I think barren, when he says I'm barren, perhaps it is to demonstrate that he is a justifiable teacher, because the midwives had to be barren, had to be in not of bearing age. So I think in a way he says, look, I'm a first income teacher. You know, I'm qualified. You know, I'm barren. So
yeah. So on the one hand, he says that Artemis is barren, like she never had a child, but then says that her followers aren't barren women, but are women who become barren. So they have the experience. So they have the experience of childbirth, but they are now barren, so they can give their attention to other, which has the implication, which isn't explicitly stated, that Socrates, when he was young, perhaps gave birth to wisdom coming through him. I mean, the other thing to say is that wisdom is from, that he says that myself and the gods help deliver the wisdom. And the suggestion is, of course, like in the Apology, that the wisdom's coming from the gods, and Socrates helps it come out. He guides it out. That's how I read it anyway.
He's also saying that wisdom or knowledge, Theaetetus, is within you. So it's not as if I've got it and I can give it to you. It's got to come from you, and I'm just the facilitator to help you bring it out.
Yeah, so it's a pedagogy in a way, isn't it? It's an educational, not just strategy, I suppose. It's more extreme than a strategy, isn't it? It's actually saying, well, I can't teach you anything.
Is that what you were saying, Maria, to that? Yeah, he's a good teacher, in fact. He's a facilitator to bring out what's already there. Yeah?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Well, I don't know if you've ever covered the Meno in your classes, Bernie, but the Meno has a similar theme, that, you know, that there's things are brought out from recollection, that your soul knows things before you're born, and then you remember these things, and then you learn them through memory, through recollection. So there's a similar kind of theme in that respect.
Yeah, we certainly have, Andrew. And then in the geometry, we actually drew we'll draw, or we have drawn, depending if people have done the course, the actual diagram that the slave draws there. So people might remember that the theory of Plato's learning as recollection, so recalling what you already know at birth, relates to this here. It's not actually, he doesn't actually talk about the theory of recollection here, does he? But it seems to be very similar. And people have noted a similarity actually between the Mimo dialogue. If you read that dialogue and this dialogue, there's lots of similarities in the development of the dialogue, but no explicit discussion of learning as recollection. I think it's sympathetic. All right. So anyone else on that? Like, I was interested in him saying, "Oh, didn't you know midwives are also the best matchmakers?" And then there was that talk about how I think he was matching. He would decide whether this student would be a student of his or whether that be a student of a sophist. That was sort of interesting side, I thought. Anyone else on the midwife thing? Okay, well, we're getting towards the end, so I'll give a bit of an introduction to next week when we really get into the depths of this. But before we do, just on this midwife thing, it's important to probably to see the connection with the Mimo, with the theory of recollection, to see that it's very similar to what we see in the Apology there, where all wisdom is divine, right? We don't talk about the forms, we don't talk about recollection, but all wisdom is divine. And we've talked about how this divinity, especially if we are, if there's atheists in the room and might be repulsed by this, how Plato is introducing a very formal notion of divinity that goes, that kind of goes beyond this sort of, the Greek gods and all their antics and everything, which is that they are immortal, that the forms are immortal, sensible, and in somehow related to the world. So it fits in with all that stuff. And gives you, if you like, a pedagogy, an educational approach. Okay, so what happens at the end of this little midwife section is that Theaetetus comes out with his first proper proposal, hypothesis about what knowledge is. And he says that, well, knowledge is perception. And this is where we engage Protagoras and the question of appearances of things and reality in itself. We also come up against being and becoming. Remember, in Plato's system, being is related to the forms. They're unchanging in important senses. And becoming is the world of experience where things are always changing. Well, there's discussion around that notion, that way of thinking, in terms of two diametrically opposed, at least in this dialogue, diametrically opposed philosophical positions. Now, I've talked about Parmenides as being a skeptic, but the basis of his skepticism is to dispute whenever anyone says there's any difference or any change. And he's just saying that all is one, that there is no difference. And whenever someone says that there is difference or there is change, he or Zeno, his bulldog, will come in and show the paradox of that claim. So Parmenides says there's just being. And then you've got Heraclitus, who, according to Plato, says there's only becoming, there's only change, that everything's in a constant state of change. Okay, so we've got the Protagoras idea, and then he brings in Parmenides and Heraclitus, and it's kind of this soup of ideas that we swim around in the next reading. So see how you go with that. It's heavy on the philosophy, but I think you guys will handle it, and we'll walk through it slowly next week. So thanks for coming, and as usual, we can stay around after we close the session, but I'm aware that that people may need to rush away, you know, get their dinner out of the oven before it burns or so on. But so stick around, but otherwise, if you're not sticking around, I'm going to turn the recording off, and see you all next week on the same Zoom link. Okay, bye.
Bye, and thank you